I am Victor Xi, in case you don't know, the Homeal Lum Chair in China and Pacific Relations at UC San Diego. So let me skip talking about myself, even though it's in the script here. Let me introduce the speaker. Today, I'm very excited to be here to discuss with Susan her latest one in a long line of course, must-read books on China called Overreach. And she's going to talk about that today. Susan, of course, is chair of the 21st Century China Center and research professor at the UC San Diego School of Global Policy and Strategy. She first visited China in 1971, shook the hands of Zhou Enlai then or later on that trip, and has been teaching, researching, and engaging China diplomatically ever since. Susan is one of the most influential experts working on US-China relations and Chinese politics, and her views on a range of issues related to modern Chinese politics are highly sought after. Susan, of course, is a very prolific researcher and writer. Her 2008 book, China, Fragile Superpower, helped frame the policy debate on China in the United States. Her other publications include, of course, the classic for those of us who study political science of China, The Political Logic of Economic Reform in China, also Competitive Comrades before that, and then a later book, Changing Media, Changing China. Her latest book, Overreach, How China Derailed Its Peaceful Rise, is truly, truly a very impressive piece of scholarship. I really urge all of you to, I think you can even buy a copy right out there, actually. But if not, then definitely order it. It covers a lot of the domestic politics, domestic intrigues within China, both in the Hu Jintao period and in the current period, as well as Chinese foreign policy in this entire period. And in the appendix, there's a list of all the relevant agencies in the Chinese government and description of it at the end, which actually is incredibly helpful. If you're doing business or studying China, you need that list. So without further ado, let us welcome Susan Shirk as she talks about the new book.
Thanks to all of you for coming. It's wonderful to have in-person events again. And of course, for me, it's a great thrill to give the first talk on my new book here at UC San Diego with my colleagues and students and friends from the community. So I'm grateful that you came. Well, I never do anything without showing the picture of me shaking Zhou Enlai's hand. I'm an old China hand, and I've been studying China for more than 50 years. I was lucky enough to visit China in 1971 and meet Premier Zhou Enlai, along with my colleague Paul Pickowitz, who has his own picture that he shows frequently as well. I also was lucky enough to serve in the Clinton administration and work for Madeleine Albright. For most of my career, China has been a positive story. Relations between China and the world, including the United States, were getting better over this post-Mao period, and Chinese leaders were pursuing a strategy of self-restraint in order to reassure the world that it wasn't a threat, even though its capabilities were growing. So that was the peaceful rise period. But suddenly, things changed in the mid-2000s. And this was before the Olympics and before the global financial crisis. China started asserting its claims over maritime space, especially the South China Sea, the waters of the South China Sea and the rocks and islands within it. Domestically, it tightened up social control right before the Olympics. It's in a drive to Weiwen, we call it in China, stability maintenance, tightening up party control over the media, internet, society, and economy. So I was puzzled that this shift occurred during the Hu Jintao collective leadership period. And if you read my book, as Victor said, there's a lot in there about the Hu Jintao collective leadership. But I'm going to focus today more on the Xi Jinping period. By the end of the Hu Jintao's decade, Xi was the anointed successor about to take the throne. There was an open split in the leadership, a challenge really to Xi Jinping's succession to power. And there was a major crisis in the East China Sea as China and Japan really clashed over the Diaoyu Senkaku Islands in the East China Sea that both of them claim. The rampant corruption of the Hu Jintao collective leadership gave Xi Jinping the ability to make the case for more concentrated strongman power, and the party supported that. But the party elite got a more dictatorial leader than they had anticipated. Now here, compare the front page of People's Daily from the party congress when Xi first, as the anointed successor, became the leader of China. His face is roughly the same size as that of his colleagues in the Standing Committee. But 5 years later, at the 19th Party Congress, his face completely dominates those of the other members of the Standing Committee. So today is really a good moment for us to step back and assess the Xi Jinping decade in power, because we're about to have the 20th Party Congress. And according to past precedent, Xi Jinping should be retiring now and handing over power to a successor. That's what Jiang Zemin did, that's what Hu Jintao did. But Xi has shattered the precedent, the norm of peaceful turnover of power at the top. And this is really a radical change which is likely to undercut the resilience of Communist Party rule in China, because the regular, predictable turnover of power at the top reduces the risk of power struggles. So, and certainly it has alarmed many other members of the Chinese elite. And during my interviews in China, I have never heard such sharp criticism of a leader as I heard after Xi abolished the term limits for the presidency, which effectively meant that he could be not just president, but general secretary of the party and head of the military commission for 3 5-year terms, or indeed, most likely, for life. So what one word might sum up the Xi Jinping decade? you won't be surprised that the word I suggest is overreach. Overreach means to take things too far or do things in an exaggerated way that ends up being costly to yourself. It's self-defeating action. And certainly today I'm going to review some of the ways in which China's actions are creating costs for China. And the costs are piling up, dragging down the economy and sparking a strong international backlash against China. So today I'm going to quickly summarize the main examples of overreach. There are quite a few. I'm just going to touch on some of the main ones in foreign policy as well as domestic policy. Then I'm going to open up the black box of domestic politics, as my book does, based largely on interviews in China, to explain what is driving this overreach. And then at the end, I'll offer a few brief remarks on how the United States should respond while avoiding overreacting to the China threat. Okay, so what we see in terms of foreign policy overreach, first of all, confrontations with other Southeast Asian countries over sovereignty claims. Xi Jinping dusted off plans that had been on the shelf for years to build large artificial islands on top of the rocks that China claims in the South China Sea and fortify them with military installations, despite pledging to President Obama not to militarize them. Also bullying the other claimants who, according to international law, have rights to the coastal waters as well as the rocks and islands in them. Here you see China's Coast Guard and maritime militia lashed together at Whitsun Reef, also claimed by the Philippines, lingering for weeks there to establish China's claim and block Filipino fishermen from fishing. This just happened in the last year. China also is overreaching by intensifying Coast Guard and naval and Air Force pressure against Japan and Taiwan. With Xi Jinping at the helm here, Xi has taken on a new role. In addition to being head of the military, the Central Military Commission, he now has made himself commander of the Joint Battle Command. So he is really operational commander of the military. China established an air defense identification zone in the East China Sea that goes over Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan in 2013. Its planes have been flying over the midline in the Taiwan Strait, and the Navy is sailing around the islands of Japan and Taiwan. After Speaker Pelosi visited Taiwan, they surrounded Taiwan with military exercises to show their ability to completely control or blockade the island. Just a couple of years ago, we had the first border conflict between China and India that produced significant loss of life, somewhere between 20 and 40 people killed on each side. Another form of overreaching under Xi Jinping is coercive economic diplomacy. using access to China's huge market to intimidate other countries and businesses to pressure them to conform with the party's positions on Taiwan, Xinjiang, Hong Kong, and what are mostly other domestic issues. They boycotted Korean products, as we see here, after South Korea installed a missile defense battery from the United States to protect against North Korea. They cut off imports, almost all imports, from Australia a couple of years ago, and here we see a graph showing the drastic reduction of Australian exports to China. They cut off those imports because Australian leaders proposed an international investigation on the origins of the COVID epidemic. So this obviously antagonized not only the countries that were targeted with this economic coercion, but also made other countries fearful of depending too much on China. And of course, China is the largest trading partner of more countries in the world than the United States is. So all of those countries are worried about that. At the end of Xi's first term, he also started defining the relationship with the West as an ideological contest, talking about the superiority of China's system, and the Trump and Biden administration have pushed back now by vilifying China's autocracy. So this kind of ideological frame really did start with China, but now many Western countries have picked up on it. And it's being articulated, of course, by Chinese diplomats who now are known as wolf warriors based on a nationalist Chinese film. Wolf warriors is kind of an oxymoron, isn't it? Wolf warrior diplomacy. You know, diplomacy is supposed to be how we improve relations with other countries. But this is really picking fights and alienating other countries by tough talk on Twitter or in speeches. Zhao Lijian is the best known wolf warrior. He tweeted from his position in Pakistan, and it earned him a major promotion to be foreign ministry spokesman. Belt and Road Initiative, this very ambitious Chinese effort, which is really kind of branded by Xi Jinping, a personal prestige effort by Xi Jinping, is a grandiose plan to link China by rail, roads, pipelines, all the way to Europe through Central Asia. And it's now left China struggling to collect repayment of loans for these projects. So it's not clear that it's really been beneficial for China, and that's why I put it in the category of overreach. Perhaps, well, one of the most shocking bolts from the blue that Xi Jinping launched was the destruction of Hong Kong's political freedoms. By suddenly imposing a national security law, Hong Kong national security law in 2020. Of course, this violated China's agreement with the UK to maintain Hong Kong's high degree of autonomy for 50 years. But now there's a PRC, a Chinese government security agency, answering directly to the party and with the authority to investigate cases and try them on the mainland that is based in Hong Kong. The dean of the University of Hong Kong Law School was quoted as saying, never in his wildest imagination would he have thought there would be a PRC security agency in Hong Kong answering directly to the party. So really what we see is this is Beijing's takeover of Hong Kong, essentially. And lastly, Xi Jinping, by aligning himself with Vladimir Putin, pledging friendship without limits on the eve of the Olympics and also the eve of Putin's invasion of Ukraine, and then refusing to condemn it, still hasn't spoken to Zelensky in Ukraine, even though Ukraine once its largest trading partner was China. And American officials have speculated publicly that Putin probably misled Xi Jinping. And we actually, the United States, shared intelligence with China, which is a highly unusual thing to do with a country we view as a strategic competitor. And yet, Xi Jinping still has refused to criticize the Russian invasion and continues to align himself with Russia, although China has not provided tangible military support for the Russian forces. So all of these foreign policy instances of overreach have led to a global backlash against the China threat, not just in the United States. Here you see the German trade minister, economics minister, just last month saying that we cannot allow ourselves to be blackmailed by China. So Germany is trying, even Germany is trying to decouple from China. So many governments and businesses are trying to reduce their economic reliance on China. The European Union broke off negotiations on a bilateral investment and trade treaty that was almost finished because Beijing had sanctioned members of the European legislature. Timing not too good. They're about to sanction members of the legislature who, of course, the legislature is now hard over against the China threat. And this agreement was tabled, postponed, and is unlikely to ever be signed. And even some of our most bullish international investors are so worried about the political risk inside China and are starting to diversify away from China. In Asia, we see a number of defense coalitions established to balance against China, including the Quad, AUKUS, in which the UK and the United States are joining to help Australia acquire nuclear-powered submarines. And we have, for the first time, here's a French naval vessel joining the United States in a transit of the Taiwan Strait. And we have other Europeans joining the US in patrolling the South China Sea as well. And maybe the most important new development that China has brought on itself is that Taiwan now defines the defense of Taiwan as essential to Japan's national security and is coordinating more with the United States in preparing to defend Taiwan if need be. Okay, that's only foreign policy. There's also a number of examples of overreach on the domestic front. Of course, I know that this talk is a little too long, so I'm just going to tick them off without saying too much about them. They should be familiar to all of you who are avid newspaper readers. The thought reform camps for Muslims in Xinjiang that look a lot like concentration camps. But these camps are really, Xinjiang's situation is only at the extreme end of the social control spectrum. We also see intensified party control over social life, media, and internet. And here's a picture of the facial recognition software that the police and can use in order to track individuals. But I think that sometimes people exaggerate the significance of the technologies itself, because in China, the use of these technologies is combined with a kind of structure in which people are encouraged to watch one another in neighborhoods, in work organizations, and of course, this kind of practice of mutual watching is something that was inherited from the Mao era. Of course, the abolition of the presidential term limits is itself a major example of overreaching, which has alarmed a lot of people inside China. We also see a crackdown on the media. China's media, up through the first term of Hu Jintao, had been very vibrant, real civil sphere emerging on Weibo and investigative journalism. But now we have very homogeneous reporting in China's media. It looks much more like Mao-era propaganda in that respect than what we had seen in the post-Mao era under Jiang and Hu. And we have a very ideological effort. This is a Xi Jinping. It's an app that people are required to download on their devices in order to do ideological study. And their bosses, their supervisors, party secretaries check up to make sure that they've done their homework. The state is also pouring billions of dollars into technological self-reliance for national security. Of course, this is what has now driven the US and other countries to seek to decouple from China. And of course, it's very wasteful as well. One of the most shocking examples of overreach was the sudden, unanticipated crackdown by the party and government on private businesses in the summer of 2021 in the name of security and loyalty to the party. The thunderclap was the decision reportedly made by Xi Jinping himself to block a $34 billion IPO by Ant Group, which is part of Alibaba. Just 2 days before Ant was set to go public on the Shanghai and Hong Kong exchanges that wiped out billions of dollars of equity value and imposed a lot of new restrictions, not just on Ant, Alibaba, but other internet platform companies like Tencent, and blocking them to cancel or delay their IPOs and forcing them to lay off workers. That's one of the main reasons that today there are almost 20% of youth in China, university graduates, are unemployed, which is something that is a big change from the trends up until that time. Also, they demolished the after-school tutoring industry completely, which reduces opportunities for English language learning. And they're forcing companies to contribute to state charities in the name of Xi's latest project, Common Prosperity. So instead of letting the market drive the economy, Xi has put the Chinese Communist Party right in the middle of it. I think people ask, why did he do it? I mean, it's been so devastating to China's economic dynamism and to employment. I think the only answer is because it really doesn't make sense in economic terms at all. So it appears to be motivated by the desire to prevent big private companies from becoming alternative power centers in China. I mean, Xi is even using this Marxist slogan, prevent the disorderly expansion of capital. It's just a little surprising to hear that kind of language coming back in China after decades of market reforms. And as this slide shows, this effort has driven some of the leading entrepreneurs to step down from their executive positions, and some of them to leave China as well. So Xi Jinping, by politicizing economic policymaking, is putting China's unprecedented economic success at risk. And then the example of overreach that's probably gotten the most attention outside of China is his stubborn persistence in carrying out this extreme zero COVID approach to managing the epidemic. She had claimed China's management of COVID as proof of the superiority of China's socialist system at a time that certainly the United States was flailing around and not doing a very good job of managing our epidemic here. And so now he just refuses to adjust the policy, even though Omicron is a much more contagious and less virulent form of the disease. I think Xi Jinping may also feel somewhat politically vulnerable because at the earliest stage of COVID in China, he, in his own account, he issued instructions during a Politburo Standing Committee meeting on January 7th about containing the epidemic. But on the other hand, he didn't inform the public until January 20th that it was a contagious disease. So between the 7th and the 20th, quite a few people in China got sick and died. because not just because the local government was covering it up, but also the central government failed to inform people about the risk. Now, he's turned zero COVID into a symbol of the superiority of his own leadership and of the system. And in May of this year, he summoned the standing committee to a meeting and insisted that they biaotai, that they stand behind him and declare that they, together with him, would resolutely struggle against all words and deeds that distort, question, or dismiss zero COVID. So it's become a matter of ideological loyalty, not of what is really the best way to protect the health of people in China. So this is really kind of disturbing and shocking, because for years, everyone has taken for granted China's pragmatic leadership, that they would adjust policies to make sure that the economy kept growing, living standards improved, so that they could sustain public support for Communist Party rule. The party was synonymous with economic development. But now Xi's actions are damaging its own economy and in turn damaging global economic growth as well. Ideology and loyalty to the leader are trumping economic development. So what's going on here? Why is the Xi regime overreaching in this way? I argue in my book that it's the result of the structure of the political system he has created, a highly centralized, personalistic regime with echoes of Mao Zedong dictatorship. So after Mao died, Deng Xiaoping tried to make sure that China would never have another Mao. He recognized and publicly stated that the over-concentration of power leads to arbitrary decision-making, and that's what was the problem with the Mao regime. That's what caused the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, these tragic campaigns that were devastating to Chinese society. But he didn't carry out wholesale demaoization. You still see Mao's picture in Tiananmen Square, and Xi Jinping never encouraged the development of political checks and balances outside the party. He did encourage term limits, retirement ages, more frequent regular meetings of Central Committee, Politburo, the collective institutions within the party. But the legislature, the legal system, never was allowed, and Deng Xiaoping didn't want to allow them to establish independent authority to check the actions of Chinese power holders, Chinese politicians. So that's why it was relatively easy for Xi Jinping to concentrate power and to restore this personalistic leadership dictatorship. So Xi has taken over direct control of the police and the military as well as the party. He leads almost all the party leading groups. and relies only on a small circle of trusted advisors rather than the professionals in government. Even within the Standing Committee, other 6 leaders are advised not to disagree with Xi in meetings. And there's really no counterweight in this type of system to the strategic myths that Xi Jinping inculcates about the Western plots against China. Xi launched his reign with a massive anti-corruption campaign. And this anti-corruption campaign is effectively a purge of his potential rivals. And here's a graph of the number of officials punished over the last decade. And you can see that it just continues to increase. The anti-corruption campaign acknowledges that it's not just about corruption. It's also about plots, conspiracies to split the party. And most strikingly, Xi went after the former security czar, Zhou Yongkang, as well as Bo Xilai, the party secretary of Chongqing, who had effectively challenged Xi's succession to power. Now the purge continues. We're really in the 3rd wave of purges in China, in which just in the last few weeks, they have convicted, given life sentences, capital death penalty, but suspended them to a number of the inquisitors who had carried out the purge. The members of the disciplinary bureaucracy and the secret police. So Xi is purging the people who were so trusted that they'd helped him purge the other politicians. This is what Zbigniew Brzezinski called the permanent purge. It just goes on and on and on. So it's no surprise that the people who aren't in prison are very fearful of becoming the target of this purge. And they therefore go all out to prove their loyalty to Xi Jinping. Here's an example. You probably can't read it, but this is the senior-most foreign policy official in China, Yang Jiechi. And here's his speech. Shows you have to praise Xi Jinping basically in every sentence to show that you are personally loyal to him. And here's another senior foreign policy maker, Wang Yi, who's the foreign minister and the state counselor responsible for foreign policy. He is a person I know Yang Jiechi too, but Wang Yi I know better, and I have had tremendous respect for him because he was the architect of China's reassurance policy in Asia. He was the one he negotiated with Japan, with Abe, so Abe would stop going to Yasukuni Shrine. And he was the architect of the effort under Hu Jintao to reassure the people of Taiwan by building more economic ties across the strait. So his Taiwan policy was also very pragmatic and restrained. But now you hear him talk, you'd never know it was the same person. It's 200% echoing everything that Xi Jinping says. Finally, so you have Xi Jinping's purge, this atmosphere of fear. You have officials tripping over one another in their competition to move up in the system by proving their loyalty by bandwagoning on Xi Jinping's policies. As they implement Xi's policies, domestic and foreign policy, they're taking them further than Xi Jinping himself might have originally wanted. You get this over-compliance effect from bandwagoning. Lastly, all the information feedback loops in the system have now failed because nobody dares report up the system the truth about the damage that many of these policies are doing to China. And in fact, when we observe how local officials are carrying out zero COVID, and you probably read about the accident in Guiyang in which people were killed on a bus, forcing people into quarantine outside the city. And it looks an awful lot like the Great Leap Forward. It looks like the Great Leap Forward in that local officials overdo the implementation of the policy and they don't report back up the chain what are the really damaging consequences of the policy. So I was going to take some time to talk about US policy, but it's only the last chapter of the book. So I think I won't take the time to do it now. I'd rather that we discuss. I'd really like to hear your questions, Victor's questions, and talk about them. So if you want to raise questions about US policy, feel free to do so. Thanks so much. You like, well, which one do you want? Do you want that one or do you want this one? This one's pretty, that's pretty good too. Oh, the other one? Okay.
Great. So I think we can go over a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I heard. But let's see here. Wonderful talk. And again, if you haven't read the book, go and get it and read it. For those of us who specialize in China, it goes quickly, but you also learn a great deal from the book. So today, I saw the latest news item is Kissinger went to China, met with Wang Yi. Or maybe
no,
not
Wang
in China.
Yi came here.
Oh, Wang Yi came here, met with Kissinger. And then, of course, the next thing Kissinger says is like the Chinese leadership is going to turn around, right? So suppose that is serious. Of course, we can be skeptical or whatever. What is one thing Xi Jinping can do to convince the US government that he is serious about backing down from overreach?
Well, the best thing he could do, or one of the things, is to just close the camps in Xinjiang. And some people are saying they've been closed. And I'm puzzled by that because if they've been closed, why haven't they told us or shown us? Because it would obviously change our perspective on China dramatically, plus it would reduce, maybe we would drop all these sanctions related to Xinjiang with cotton clothing or actually anything sourced in Xinjiang now, we have sanctions on. So I think that would be really dramatic. I have a few other suggestions that are in the book, like resume dialogue with Taiwan. Just talk to them. but I don't want to go through all the reasons they think they don't want to talk to them, but they should, and so that the idea of peaceful reunification continues. It doesn't disappear.
Great. I guess we can open it up to the floor now, in the interest of time. Well, no, I mean, I have a lot of questions, but just
we
because
can talk about it later.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, over here in front. Yeah.
I want to know if you have opinions about the seed of all this. Did Mr. Xi come in with plans to move down this path, or would you point to certain events that evolved over time that pushed him further and further down the path?
Well, first of all, we political scientists know that you can never actually get inside people's minds, so we don't know. But it certainly looks like he had a plan to carry out the rejuvenation of the party, but he didn't let others know about it. He definitely fooled other people. People in the Chinese elite were definitely surprised, no doubt about that.
I'm a little mystified about the zero tolerance COVID policy. It seems to be, we hear that it's very unpopular, that it's dragged on for so long, particularly in some of the larger population areas. Could you delve a little bit deeper why they're so insistent on continuing this zero policy?
No, I agree that it's curious and puzzling, which is why I threw in, I think I'm the only person in the China field who thinks that Xi Jinping might still feel vulnerable because of what happened during January, and that might be a factor in his defensiveness about zero COVID. But if they took all the resources, the money, the people who are now focused on this testing regime and put them all into vaccination, they would be able to make the transition. I think the vaccination program also got fouled up because there was this nationalist resistance to having the foreign vaccine. They hoped they would develop their own vaccine fast enough, but it's a hard thing to do. So it's been delayed. But it's hubris. It's nationalist hubris, and the hubris of Xi Jinping's personal leadership that he really won't adjust his policy. And I'm sure that there are many people in China at the elite level who really wish that he would. Now, when we do surveys here at the China Data Lab and 21st Century China Center, we find that the central government, people still continue to support the central government and are quite positive about it. So don't get the impression that the Chinese public is, very discontented, on the verge of revolt. That's not the case. But certainly the lockdown of Shanghai had a big impact on all those people living in Shanghai, as well as other cities too.
Should we ask an online question, or? Oh yeah. Why don't we have this question?
Yeah, I was wondering what does China think of world opinion, or what matters to them or to Xi, what the world thinks, US thinks, or whoever? Is that of concern to them at all?
Actually, Chinese leaders, including Xi Jinping, I believe, still really aspire for China to be respected by the world. I don't think even Xi, he does not want to be a big rogue state, you know, part of an axis of evil with North Korea. He wants China to be respected. And so I think that the challenge for American diplomacy is to help Xi Jinping pursue that ambition in a peaceful manner, in a manner that doesn't abuse the interests and values of other countries. And I think it's certainly possible to do that. And I think we have to show that we're open to that. We're not just trying to trip up China as it rises.
So a couple questions from online. I'm going to try to combine a few. We'll see how successful I am. So there's a question if there's any internal factors that would stop him from stopping these overreaching policies, whether there's entrenched political interests in favor of the current path that he would have to overcome. And also a question about, on the converse, are there any potential factions that could check Xi's power remaining? Although I think that's more of a, anyway, yeah.
Well, taking the second one first about constraints on Xi, just a few days ago, the 21st Century China Center had a discussion of what to expect after the 20th Party Congress, and in which we talked among ourselves, and this is in our little policy brief that you can get online, you know, what it would take to have a more or less constrained Xi Jinping after the 20th Party Congress. And thanks to Victor's great work, you know, we have a pretty good idea of what are the possibilities. And it's definitely possible that we would have a somewhat at the margin, more constrained Xi Jinping. And that might mean more internal debate about what's the right thing to do in any policy area. And, you know, I do have this fantasy of the other senior leaders saying to Xi Jinping, you know, it's so unfair that you have to take all this responsibility on yourself. And, you know, we're willing to share more of it with you if it would be helpful, only if it would be helpful to you. So if you'd like to divide up the leading groups a little bit more or whatever, we're willing to do that. So, you know, I don't think it's totally impossible that you would see a somewhat more collective process in the third term, but the odds are against it. I think the odds are for more concentrated power, more overreach, higher risks of power struggle, and higher risks of international conflict.
Would you speak a little bit more about the situation with China and Russia? At what point does Putin do something that China actually pushes back on? Obviously, I'm talking about Ukraine. Can you speak a little bit more about their relationship?
Well, I think a big part of their relationship is their personal relationship. As two strongman leaders who have been condemned by the rest of the world. And Also, two leaders who are very fearful that the West is planning to bring them down through color revolutions, through interfering in their domestic politics. So they're very afraid of that. And I think she definitely appreciated Putin coming to the Olympics, whereas no other major leader did. So it would take quite a lot, I think, for him to divorce Putin. They do have sort of a bromance, as we call it here. But I think using nuclear weapons, I don't think I think that would be one thing. It's hard for me to think of what else. I think otherwise, if we have a long war of attrition in Ukraine, I don't think you're going to see Xi openly criticizing Russia. They'll continue to ideologically and politically cooperate, even if they don't contribute to the military capabilities of the Russian forces.
Great speech and terrific book, and I'd like to. What lessons? Okay. What lessons do you think the Chinese have taken away from the Ukraine war and Russia's poor performance, and particularly on the question of Russian relations? You made the point a moment ago that the Russians may have misled Xi Jinping prior to the Olympics. And as you know, the Chinese are very careful negotiators to say, we have a friendship without limits. That kind of open language is almost unheard of in a Chinese communique. And very recently, Putin has implied that Xi Jinping has questions about what they were doing and are doing in Ukraine. So I wonder if you could analyze what lessons the Chinese might take away from that in terms of their policies or future policies vis-a-vis Taiwan.
Well, I found that whole meeting between Xi and Putin very puzzling. You know, why are we hearing from Putin that China has questions? He said the same thing about Modi. So, I don't know. I mean, that's really, I really don't know. I think it's very difficult for Xi to publicly criticize Russia. So maybe this was a way of trying to show that he's not completely in the Russian camp. But he doesn't say it, he has Putin say it. And this is orchestrated ahead of time. I really don't, I have no idea.
But if you're the PLA and you watch the way...
Oh, that's another question, yeah.
But that's what I'm trying, in other words, look what Putin thought he was doing in Ukraine compared to what actually happened. What lessons would Xi draw from that in terms of his conversations?
Well, I think, I don't know, is Ty here? Ty would probably say that they would say, well, we're really on the right track. We've been doing the right thing. We've been developing our ability for joint operations, and we're, in that respect, a much more modern military than the Russian military is. Ty, would you like to make a comment?
I agree, but I think at the end, China said, well, we might not have, we're not thinking about the right war. It's like we've done all the right things, but the type of war that the Russians are fighting is not what we're thinking about fighting.
It's a completely different challenge,
Yeah.
military challenge, right? Yeah.
Okay. Regarding Taiwan, okay, so Taiwan is actually extremely critical, not only for the US, but for the whole world, because it manufactures 90% of the cutting edge semiconductors, 50% of all the other semiconductors. So what is happening also at this time is that we are reshoring. The US is reshoring. Today, President Biden's made a speech in the New York State with IBM, huge investments with the Chip and Science Act. The same is happening in the EU, in Korea. So everybody, all the know-how in Taiwan is getting, transferred a little bit all over the place. Is there a chance that the US policy toward Taiwan, not a chance, but is it possible that it will decrease over time as the criticality of Taiwan will become lesser due to this know-how being distributed from an industrial perspective?
I didn't understand the last part. Are you suggesting that the U.S.
That the policy of the US,
willingness to defend Taiwan will diminish?
simply because there's less interest,
I don't think so. I don't think that will happen. I think the greater danger now is that we'll kill Taiwan with our love. In other words, we'll provoke a mainland attack by going overboard in all these symbolic ways to show how much we love Taiwan. And, instead of concentrating on how do we effectively defend Taiwan militarily if need be. A lot of this symbolic expressions of love are actually counterproductive for Taiwan's security.
Okay, we can only take one more.
You mentioned that so many of these foreign and domestic policies are detrimental to China's economic development and relations with other countries. So what's his overarching goal? Why is he doing this? That's my first question. And the second question is...
No, just one, I think.
Oh, okay.
Just one. Well, my argument is that it's the perverse effects of China's political institutions that lead him to make these kind of mistakes that are costly. It's not so much that he's got some goal. His goals are, he's an ambitious leader. He wants China to be not just a regional, but a global power. He wants the party to survive and flourish and to maintain popular support in China for the party and for him. So I think that's pretty straightforward. It's not something special. It's pretty much the same objectives that all Chinese leaders in the communist era have had.
Great. With that, thank you very much, Susan, for answering all these questions. And the book, again, is on sale right out there, so you can very quickly pick up a copy. We do have some future events, so go to our website, china.ucsd.edu. This is also where you will find a video of today's events, as well as our other events online. Thank you very much, Susan. This is a great
Victor.
book. And,
okay. Thanks, everybody. Okay.